If you've even gotten so much as a whiff of history, you might have heard of entities such as the Frankish Kingdom, or the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or the Anuradhapura Kingdom. And you might have also heard of the Roman Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, or the Russian Empire, and wonder why some monarchies are called kingdoms and others empires. So with all that in mind, what exactly does it mean to be an empire? And is there enough historical significance behind all this pedantry to give KhAnubis an easy video for this week? If you look from the samples I gave in the intro, you might have come to the conclusion that an empire is like a kingdom, but bigger. Indeed, this is how the two terms are normally used, as a kingdom is basically a nation-state ruled by a king, whereas an empire generally spans a vast, often diverse area, namely with other smaller entities under its control. Like for instance with the Persian Achaemenid Empire, whose ruler was known as the King of Kings, due to the arrangement of the empire, even though they technically didn't call it an empire, but we'll get to that in a second. That being said, this whole thing is a lot like trying to describe the difference between states and provinces, a story for another time, maybe. In that there might be a sound definition, but nations are generally just going to use whatever they feel like, especially if one gives them more prestige. The term empire came not as a way to better categorize historical powers, but as a way for someone in ancient Rome to justify themselves having all the power after 509 BC. You see, the Roman Empire might be the most well-known phase in Roman history, but Rome initially started off as the Roman Kingdom. But this change didn't come about because Rome expanded in size. Rather, by 509 BC, they basically had this one king who sucked so bad that they not only deposed him, but completely abandoned the idea of having kings at all, establishing the Senate-run Roman Republic in its place. The Senate generally elected consuls to oversee the affairs of the Republic, at home and on the frontier. They elected 2 at a time for 1-year terms as a way to make sure no one could gather too much political power, as wanting to be king of Rome was essentially the worst crime a Roman could commit, even long into the imperial period. Thus, when some guy named Augustus did get all the power for himself and created a hereditary office where he was in charge of everything, he needed to convince everyone that he wasn't a king, he was just the commander. Yeah, commander. Or in Latin, imperator. Which, yeah, I think you can see the etymological pattern here. It's kind of like how an absolute dictatorship today might call itself a republic, as all that republic really means is a country without a monarchy. So emperor, and therefore empire, were originally made up as ways for someone to essentially become king of a realm where kings were a serious taboo. But this definition would gradually change a little bit, as it was noticed that the Roman Empire was a little bit different from the smaller kingdoms that arose after its fall. Not just in how the rulers prefer to be addressed, but also in another crucial way. Now, Google defines an empire as, quote, an extensive group of states or countries ruled over by a single monarch, an oligarchy, or a sovereign state, suggesting that the qualifications for being an empire aren't necessarily being a territory merely ruled over by someone who calls themselves an emperor, but rather being an entity with multiple groups under one's control. This definition could include basically every country throughout history that has spanned multiple different regions, including Russia, the US, or India. However, an empire's territories are generally in an unequal subservient relationship to the ruling power, and if the powers are democratic, they don't generally give the subservient territories all that much of a voice. This, however, is in contrast to more equal commonwealths or federations, who are still largely centralized, but give their subdivisions more of a say in how everything is done, as is the case in countries like Russia, the US, or India. Wait, hang on. That's definitely one restriction, besides control over other powers, on the qualifications of being an empire, as an empire is almost inherently unequal in terms of where its resources flow and who makes all the decisions. The Roman Empire was actually a great example of this, as they only expanded into other regions, conquering numerous tribes and kingdoms and bringing them under their fold, to gain access to more wealth and resources. Perhaps another good example would be all the European colonial empires, with colonies mainly set up for the benefit of the home country, regardless of the human or environmental cost on said colonies. The colonial empires also bring up another characteristic, in that the territories, or in this case colonies, of an empire might have been administered by a far-off country on pretty much all levels, but they might not have necessarily been part of that country. More integrated than puppet states, but not so much as core territories. For instance, the British Empire wasn't so much a supersized United Kingdom, but rather the United Kingdom and a whole bunch of crown colonies, either ruled over directly from London or with some autonomy, in which case they'd be referred to as self-governing colonies, but still didn't necessarily have all that much of a say in British or imperial politics. Empires can have a lot of upsides for those in charge, but they can be expensive to maintain, and it's when the costs of administering and defending a colony surpass the benefits taken from its resources, location, or influence that an empire has a bit of a problem. In a sense, this is how empires fall. Basically when they can no longer pay the imperialism bills, and their provinces or colonies are left vulnerable to either be taken by another empire or to gain independence. Because if you've been ruling over them, they probably don't really like you all that much. Building a vast empire was something nations used to brag about. But after the devastation of the world wars and the subsequent disbanding of all the colonial empires, as well as the emergent power of the nation-state and democracy as a whole, calling a country an empire became almost more of a condemnation, perhaps notably in the concept of American imperialism, an idea that refers not only to America's westward expansion through the idea of manifest destiny, but also to a perception of American foreign policy, largely in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Oceania, often touted in these circles as America's backyard. The idea of calling the United States an empire, as you can probably tell, is not one meant as a compliment to the US, but as a strong criticism. Technically, only one empire still remains today, but only in the sense that the one country has a king who calls himself an emperor, that country being Japan, which, at least nowadays, is about as individual nation-state-y as you can get, so not really all that much of an empire. Thank you as always for watching. If you want to support the channel, you can check out the Patreon page or the merch store, or even just like the video, share it with someone who might be interested, and subscribe to learn something new every Sunday. Except for this coming week, because this week's video, as part of a group collaboration, will actually be out on Friday. So stay tuned for that.